Hello, everyone. I just wanted to introduce myself and introduce this channel. So, my name is Jared Jones. I've been a Tibetan Buddhist for about 17 years. I trained mainly with Geshe Dakpa Tokyal in Charleston, South Carolina, and a gentleman by the name of Kimball Whitfield, who was a layperson who's quite extraordinary. Um, I could really spend all day talking about Mr. Whitfield, but rather than doing so, I think I'll continue on for now. So, the intention of this channel is to create a resource where lay people and those who don't intend to go into retreat for really probably more than 3 months at a time throughout their entire lives can really start to take the essence of the Buddha's teachings and apply them to their lives, and to do so without compromise and without excuses. In terms of the rest of my pedigree, I have fairly extensive background in academic work as well. At the moment, I'm getting a PhD that attempts to put Tibetan Buddhism and European philosophy into conversation with each other. Not for the first time, although really the type of conversation that I'm trying to create, I think, is a first time event in the history of the world. I haven't seen this level of detail discussed between Tibetan Buddhism and European philosophy. There's been quite a bit of discussion between European thought systems, in particular science and Tibetan Buddhism, and in particular science and the Gelug tradition of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. But there hasn't been a whole lot of interchange and sort of exchange of information between what are two very extraordinary canons of thought about the human condition. So that's what I'm doing for my PhD. In terms of my master's prior to this, I did quite a bit on the science of meditation. Essentially, the argument for my master's was that if scientists were to take the traditional models of mind training quite seriously and to use those as a basis to further scientific research, that scientific research would likely be carried out much more quickly. And part of that work needs to be the involvement of expert scholars of those traditions. By not including people like Tibetan geshes, for example, in trying to understand what shine is, what shamatha, what calm abiding is, and therefore what all the stages are, what the results are, all the ways that a person can go wrong, et cetera, et cetera. It just doesn't seem, in my opinion, that scientists are, with rare exception, actually studying meditation at all. What they're studying is all sorts of things that happen when people sit down and try to focus for the first time, which is mental development. We would call that bhavana, but it's not yet meditation. It's not yet, certainly not yet a jhana, certainly not yet a samadhi, certainly not yet shine or shamatha, right? So this was the big argument among a host of other arguments that I made in my master's work, and then for my bachelor's, I did a fairly extensive treatment of great compassion in the Gelug tradition. So my entire academic career has really been oriented also towards the Gelug tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. That being said, my main mentor had an extensive background in Zen and martial arts. He also had an extensive background in Mahamudra of the Tibetan tradition, in particular the Gelug Mahamudra. And of course, also he trained in Gelug Tantra as well. And so his point of view in terms of Buddhist teachings was really influenced by all of these. It wasn't taught as just the Gelug. It wasn't taught as just Zen, just the martial approach to Zen. It wasn't taught even just really only relying on the traditional resources of Zen and Tibetan Buddhism, which is part of why I find it so fascinating. His approach was to, well, first of all, to take what could be taken from the worldview in which we're raised, by and large, if you're raised as a global modern person, if you're raised with a modern scientific education, if you're raised with the cultural values that sort of inhere in the English language and European thought systems that have now made their way all across the world. There are things that you will simply take on board because you're speaking English. There's things you will take on board, whether you like it or not, if you take on certain types of European thought systems. And he was extremely aware of this. And so the way that he taught was deeply influenced by both European philosophy and European science, which I think is how I ended up where I have. So, as I said, the main intention of this channel is to create a series of videos, a series of resources, mainly based upon my main mentor's teachings, such that ordinary people, lay people that have no intention of entering monastic life, have no intention of entering into extended meditation retreat in a cave somewhere, can indeed make genuine progress along the path. That being said, today I'd like to discuss a few really critical personalities in the Buddhist canon. I'm not going to discuss very many. As a matter of fact, I think I'm only going to discuss one today. The big challenge that I've seen in the Western Buddhist tradition as it stands today is that it's almost entirely dominated by the history of monastics, monks, nuns, and dominated by the most extraordinary lay renunciates of Buddhist history. For example, if you were to think of the most famous examples of renunciants in Japan and Buddhist practitioners in Japan, most likely the names that come to mind are going to be people like Rinzai, people like Dogen, people like maybe Miyamoto Musashi, if you've done a little more reading, Takuan, and so on. And so when the big names come to mind, they are all monks, nuns, and people like Musashi, who lived in the woods for years, and towards the end of his life lived in a cave for years. What we're missing, I think, as Western people trying to engage in Buddhism, maybe for the first time, even if we've been at it for a while, 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years, is really inspiring examples of lay people throughout the course of history that have gained the same realizations as people that went into caves, the same realizations as people that joined nunneries, the same realizations as people who gained monastic or entered monastic institutions. So my hope, my deep, deep hope, is that on the one hand, I'd like to, over the course of time, present the biographies of some of these great lay people for us Westerners like myself, who never intend to live in the way that some of the great saints of Buddhism lived. That being said, I was very close to becoming a monk. I was very, very close. And it was actually my main mentor. It was Kimball Whitfield who said, don't become a monk. He convinced me not to over the course of about a year. And the reason that he gave was that if I became a monk, most people in the world, not understanding what a monk is, wouldn't be able to relate with who I was and what I was doing. And that because of this, therefore, I wouldn't be able to help as many people. The other thing that he said was that eventually, and of course this is now 16 years ago, he said eventually, if you'd like to get involved in Tantra, it's actually better in a lot of ways to be a layperson if you're doing that type of training. There are advantages to being a layperson. I haven't yet gotten involved in Tantra, but I've learned quite a bit about it over the course of the years. He also said that, and this is not universally true by any means. I mean, monastic life is not a walk in the park. It's extremely difficult. But he said that in lay life as a lay person, you have to carry your cross. You have to bear a lot of burdens. A lot of people depend on you for a lot of things. A lot of things go wrong. You lose a lot more because you have a lot more. So over the course of your life, you have to deal with what many people would call real life, although I don't agree with that way of putting it. But for the sake of convenience, you have to deal with real life. You have to deal with intense loss, intense sometimes gain. You have to be tested under a host of different conditions. Having bosses, having employees, having wives and husbands and children, engaging in all sorts of hobbies and social engagements that a monastic, and certainly a monastic or a layperson living in the middle of the woods, just is never going to encounter. And I don't want to sound like I'm talking down whatsoever to monastic life. I'm not. I'm simply saying that for the layperson, first of all, there are extraordinary examples of lay people who have gained realization, and my mentor of 17 years is one of those people. Secondly, there are great examples of lay people from history who didn't leave all of their responsibilities in order to gain realization, and I'm going to talk about one such person today. And finally, I'm saying that if you'd like to become a monk or nun, do become a monk or a nun. It's an extraordinary life. I know people who have done it. It's honestly, every time someone decides to take vows, I'm deeply inspired. Anytime somebody decides to enter extended retreat for a year or 2 years, 3 years, I'm extremely inspired by that. But most people aren't going to do that. And for those people, there needs to be inspiring examples that they can relate to. And there needs to be presentations of the path derived from those examples and derived from the materials that are, by and large, designed for monks and nuns and people living in caves. It needs to be presented in such a way that it is relevant to, frankly, the vast majority of Buddhists who aren't monks, nuns, or people living in the forest or in caves. So today, one such example I'd like to point to is the main mentor for Milarepa. I'm sure that anyone who's been involved in Tibetan Buddhism for more than about 10 minutes knows who Milarepa is. Milarepa, oh gosh, there's so many stories about Milarepa. But in brief, for those of you who don't know him, he He lost his father quite young. He lost his father when he was 7 years old. And in Tibet, there are, or used to be, numerous laws where essentially it prevented land from being split up when the matriarchs or patriarchs of the family passed away, so that each successive generation wouldn't end up with a smaller and smaller and smaller piece of land if there was more than one boy or girl, depending on which part of Tibet you were in. And so, because of this, all of the land that belonged to Milarepa's father didn't pass to him; it passed to his uncle and his aunt. And as when this happened, essentially his uncle started treating Milarepa and his mother like slaves, is the way that they depict it in the biographies. And Milarepa was so deeply distressed by this that he went and he learned black magic from some of the probably some of the Bon practitioners in Tibet. And he became quite extraordinarily skilled in a particular type of black magic, supposedly, that allows a person to call down hailstorms. And he waited until just before the harvest, and he brought down a hailstorm on the entire town in which he was living, where his uncle had stolen the land. That's one version. Another version is that he ended up killing a bunch of people using black magic. But no matter how you slice it, he did some pretty nasty stuff. Even if you don't believe in magic, no matter how he accomplished killing a bunch of people or destroying their property, it was quite intense and horrific. So then he wandered around for a while, went on the run, and he met, in the course of time, a very wealthy landowner by the name of Marpa. Quite popularly, he's known as Marpa Lotsawa, but if you don't speak Tibetan, and I don't speak Tibetan, you would think Lotsawa is just a last name, but Lotsawa means translator. So Marpa the translator is sort of his common name. And when he met Milarepa put him through hell, is the only way to describe it. And then Milarepa, after years of going through hell under Marpa, retreated off to some caves. He ate nothing but nettles. He got completely gaunt. He was skin and bones, and from only eating nettles, his skin turned green. But in the midst of this intense retreat for, I can't remember what it was, 2 years or 3 years or something, he gained the realization that he set out to gain. And then he started wandering the mountains, and this is where I think many of the most famous stories of his life come from, beyond the ones that I already told. Now, this is usually the standard or somewhat standard presentation of these things. For us lay people who don't intend to move to a cave and live there for 2 or 3 years, all this can do is just inspire us, really, right? What are we going to do with that example? You know? On the other hand, what's not talked about is that Lama Marpa Choki Lodro, which is his name, the teacher of Milarepa, was an extremely wealthy landowner in Tibet. He didn't give up anything. He didn't move to any caves. He had an extremely large estate. He had great wealth. According to some reports, he had 9 wives. He had 7 sons. So when Lama Marpa was young, when he was a young man, He went and he learned Sanskrit in his youth, and then he made several trips over the years to India. Some of those lasting years, right? So this is in the 11th century. This is well before someone could send you an email. Even getting a letter would take months at that distance. So initially, he spent 12 years traveling around India and getting teachings from various teachers. In particular, there were numerous teachers that he trained with at Nalanda Monastery, but he never ordained. He took empowerments in highest yoga tantra. In particular, in the beginning, in the first long trip that he took, he trained in Hevadra and Guhya Samadra tantras. He also received instructions, quite notably, in Mahamudra and the Doha songs of Saraha. Much later in his life, he took another 6-year trip, and he trained with Naropa, he trained with Maitripa, Kukaripa, and importantly, he learned the 6 yogas of Naropa, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the lineage of how the 6 yogas ended up in the Kagyu tradition. It's through Marpa's hard work of traveling to India, learning Sanskrit, training with all these great teachers, living there for years. But then he came back and he got married a few times, amassed this incredible wealth, this great estate, and he was teaching huge numbers of students out of his house. But he's really the one that exerted the most extraordinary efforts to make this information available in Tibet. That's heroic. That's emulatable. That's relatable. There are now programs where you don't need to go live in India for 12 years in order to get trained with some of the greatest living Tibetan lamas and mentors on earth. There are all sorts of programs in every major Tibetan tradition now where you can train in absolutely every aspect of the path from beginning to end with all of these teachers without leaving the comfort of your living room. So for us, it's sort of like, well, what's the excuse then, right? Marpa had to go as a young man when he still had the energy and train for years with all these monks in India and then come back. If it weren't for his astonishing drive and his capabilities, his great student, J. Milarepa, would never have become the great retreat yogi that we know. Obviously, Milarepa's fame greatly overshadowed that of Milarepa in the course of time. And it also overshadowed numerous other people's fame within Marpa Lotsawa's sort of transmission of the teachings. As a matter of fact, in the West, there's almost nobody that I've spoken with who have heard that Milarepa was only one of 4 great pillars. This is what Lama Marpa called them, the 4 great pillars of his teaching. There were 4 great students of his who inherited his teachings. Milarepa inherited a big piece of his teachings, but there was also Chokyi Dorje, who inherited the Kagyu Hevadra Tantra. And believe it or not, again, this was a lay person. Choku Dorje was a lay person, and Lama Marpa said, I'm going to give you this part of the teaching, the Hevadra Tantra part of the teaching. You're going to master this part, and your family for 7 generations will inherit this aspect of my teaching. So for 7 generations, your family as lay people will carry on this tradition. This is relatable, right? This is much more relatable than going to live in a cave. These are people with husbands and wives, kids, land, responsibilities outside of their Buddhist training, etc. One of the next pillars, Lama Surtan Wangye Dorje, was also a layperson. He inherited Lama Milarepa's Guya Samaja and Poa, which is consciousness transference lineages. Um, Also, among such practitioners in the modern day, I would also put people like my mentor, who he spent years and years and years going on retreats, short retreats, with, at the time, all of the Dalai Lama's living tutors. So I think before they passed away, that Mr. Whitfield trained with every single one of His Holiness's tutors. At one period of time, he was actually invited to receive completion stage Mahamudra teachings from the Ganden Tripa himself. So Mr. Whitfield had a marriage, he had a business, he had several businesses. He, for a period of time, he worked on Wall Street. He was a mountaineer. He was a great martial artist. He had a 4th or 5th degree black belt in Shukokai karate. Really, I could go on and on about the man, but in brief, he was a very capable yet entirely normal person, other beyond having done this extraordinary training with these extraordinary teachers. When he passed away, one of the major tantric monasteries, because his teachers knew who Kimball was and knew what his realizations were, one of the major tantric monasteries, something like 2,000 monks, all did pujas and things for him, which is just, I mean, it just boggles my mind. You know, that's what they do for high lamas. So, all that being said, there are numerous other examples, and in the course of time, I'm going to go over more of these examples, because I think that really, as lay people, we need to look to people like these. We need to understand the type of life that they lived as lay people. We need to understand how it is that we can genuinely train in this path if we're not going to become a monk or a nun or go to a cave. And that's what I'd like to do with this channel. Now, there are a few questions, of course. I spent quite a bit of time thinking about the name for this channel. And I just need to change what I have on my screen here. But I spent quite a bit of time thinking about the name, and I came up with the name Modern Western Buddhism. And so, of course, the first question is, well, what do you mean by modern and why modern? So modern. The thing about most of Buddhist material is that it was written a long time ago. I mean, a lot of the great texts of Tibetan Buddhism were written between the 6th century and the 12th century. And then a lot of the commentaries on these are things that have been written since then. But almost all of the great texts are certainly before the 14th century. When you look at the equivalent of sort of way of thinking and writing, etc., in the European canon, I mean, you're talking about like pre-Descartes. I mean, when you read that stuff, it's on a different planet, because the way that people thought, the assumptions they had, the background knowledge they had was just so extraordinarily different than we have today. That being said, I would say that in regards to the Buddhist material, you find a blend, right? There are things where you go, wow, that's extremely progressive. We just sort of caught up with that. And there are things where you go, oh my gosh, you know, we're really going to have to reinterpret this Mount Meru thing. If if we're going to use it as modern people, because we know the earth is round and there's not a big mountain in the middle. And so, of course, there are ways to do that. And a matter of fact, if you read certain texts, it actually says those sorts of things, right? It says the universe doesn't appear in a particular fashion. But we're going down. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole too far. So I've now gone on for about 30 minutes. I was planning on going on for about 5 minutes. This is a fairly regular thing in my life that I talk way too much. So I don't want to say that the ideas need to be updated. That's not the correct way of thinking about the material. The material is astonishing in its depth, clarity, meaning, profundity. At the same time, it needs to be presented in a way that modern people with modern assumptions in the cultural milieu that is by and large now shared globally in a huge number of regards, and I'll talk about that at some point, can really understand what's going on, right? That they can understand what this worldview is, what these teachings actually are, how they relate to some of the things that we now sort of just commonly think about ourselves, our minds, our bodies, the physical world. So much has changed since these texts were written. And I think something that a lot of people don't consider is that even at the time of the Buddha said in the Pali Canon, and a lot of people, they stop at the beginning of this analogy, but you should really carry it all the way through, because it's much better if you carry it all the way through. So the Buddha said that essentially if you come to a river and you need to get across, and there's no ford, there's no shallow place, you have to make a raft. But as a traveler who didn't expect this river to be there, it's not like you're carrying a raft with you. So what do? You literally walk up and down the shore and you just grab whatever's there that will float and you string it together and you climb on it and you make your way across. And then when you get to the other side, obviously you're going to just drop all this junk because it's just stuff you found laying there along the shore anyway. Now, when you translate this into, well, what does that mean for the Buddha's teachings? What this means for the Buddha's teachings, and this really does play out if you look at every epoch of Buddhist scholarship, this happens over and over and over again. Every generation of Buddhist scholars takes whatever's happening in the larger cultural milieu, the stuff they find on the shore, and they use that as the material to build the raft to get people out of the problem. Right? So if everybody believes that everything is made out of 4 elements, do you need to convince them that something else is going on in order to get them out of the problem? Or do you just use the stuff you find laying there to start getting them out of the problem? When you start looking at scholars like Dignaga and Dharmakirti, when you get a little bit further along in the Buddhist tradition, and you're getting into the Nalanda years of the Indian tradition, what are they debating? What are the tools that they're now using? What is it that they're talking about in terms of gaining realization at that point? Well, at that point, they're debating against extremely highly educated, a Brahmanical class of Hindu scholars who have studied the Vedas and the Puranas and the Buddhist texts and the Jain texts. And everyone, practically, who's of a scholarly class, including the Nalanda monks, have to deal with the problems of language, right? And Buddhism was already concerned with language prior to this, but Dignaga and Dharmakirti, and to a degree before that, really, Nagarjuna also, certainly by the time we get to Chandrakirti, Buddhapalita, Bhavaviveka, and their commentators, the issue of grammar, language, diction, the relation between an object, a term, and a meaning associated with the sound and the term, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these issues are being just debated insanely amongst essentially what we would think of as the academic class of highly educated people at the time. And so what are the Buddhist scholars writing about? The same issues, right? Okay, this is where you are. This is what you're talking about. This is what you believe. How do we get you out of the problem? We get you out of the problem by taking what you understand and transforming it, showing you where the errors are and transforming it, right? And in some cases, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama said quite recently, said, we shouldn't actually be so concerned, I'm paraphrasing, but we shouldn't be so concerned about making sure that every single Buddhist teaching traces its way back to the Buddha. Why? Because every generation of Buddhists where realizations were still occurring in those generations, were looking at the people around them and going, what does this group need to make progress? What does this group need to gain realization? And that's what they taught. Right? They didn't teach 100% what the previous generation had taught, because the needs of people had changed. The general views and ideas floating around in the culture had changed. The attitudes, the political climate had changed, etc., etc. Now, this doesn't mean that the core elements became different, but the way they're being taught, the way they're being framed changes. And sometimes practices are added on because for particular people at a particular time, those practices are already being done in a wider cultural context. And so certain practitioners train in those, like Nagarjuna, for example. Nobody knows this really, but Nagarjuna, second century Nagarjuna, the Nagarjuna, if you were in Tibetan Buddhist circles, he trained in Hindu systems of meditation. He trained in Hindu alchemy. I'm not saying he was a Hindu, but far from it. But he trained in Hindu alchemy. And there are stories where he gained certain types of what they call siddhis, certain types of meditative realizations from those trainings that allowed him to do things that the other monks couldn't do. And I think that for a lot of people, you kind of have to go, what's going on here? How could it be that Buddhism doesn't have every single technique ever invented for everything already under its roof? Well, it doesn't have that because the Buddha took what was on the shore at the time and was helpful for people at the time. And he used that, right? People were doing jhanas. So he said, okay, let's use the jhanas. So I'm simplifying somewhat, and I hope the scholars who eventually perhaps stumble upon this won't be too upset by some of the things that I've said, especially the Gelug Geshes. I hope they don't shred me to bits. This is a long-winded way of saying, why modern? Why modern? Modern because we need a way of explaining these teachings once again that doesn't lose the core meaning, doesn't lose the core information, but makes it relevant. Relevant's not the right word. Makes it intuitively, deeply relatable as a modern person. That you don't have to become a scholar of second century culture or 4th century BCE culture and language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or 11th century culture and language in order to just start penetrating the material. Because you don't need to, if someone has already done that for you. And so there need to be people who have been training in these things for some time and have the motivation sufficient to the task to not give up halfway through, etc., to carry through, bringing this into global modern culture, and in particular, because we have unbelievable, fantastic monastic and monk and nun kind of institutions, and retreat oriented institutions. But for those who aren't going to do that, or aren't going to do it probably beyond 1 month, 2 months, 3 months at a time, right? Which is us, which is most of us. It's me, it's you. So why Western? Western is a word that has all sorts of problems. It's a word that is basically fallen out of fashion, especially in the humanities, being involved in academia. If you use the word Western in a paper in the humanities, you're probably going to get in trouble. So Western is a problematic word. But I chose Western because I think for almost everyone, if you're not in the ivory tower like me, Western is still a meaningful term. It still works. People understand what you mean. What you mean is essentially European descendant people who have inherited the culture of Europeans, whether those are Canadians or they're Americans or they're Europeans, regardless of the color of their skin and their genetic background, their all of the other things notwithstanding, right? If you inherited the language, the thought systems, the habits and cultures of a European nation of some kind, that is, for all intents and purposes, the West. Why Western Buddhism? Why modern Western Buddhism? Because, once again, so much of Buddhism is wrapped up in the individual cultures of the places that they've taken root. So, to some measure, Tibetan Buddhism is wrapped up with Tibetan culture, Tibetan cultural beliefs, right? To some measure. For some teachers, this is true. I think a notable example would be something like the use of oracles, for example. To my knowledge, this is not a tradition that was found prior to the entrance into the Tibetan plateau. Amongst other Buddhist traditions, I haven't seen such a thing. And I think probably the reason for this is that the native religion and shamanistic traditions of Tibet had things like oracles, right? Like in Korea, actually all over Asia, you find this oracle tradition. Most of them are women. Some of them are men, but most of them are women. And they are trained in all sorts of ways to be able to speak with or come to embody, right, through mediumship, either a deity or a highly realized being or a Buddha, so that they can then be a channel to give some type of information that's desperately needed, or if not desperately needed, sort of needed for extremely practical reasons by either common people or for official purposes, right? So this practice is extremely common across Asia, but especially in the early Buddhist traditions, there's no hint of this prior to Buddhism sort of spreading out from its inception places. Even among the teachings of the Nalanda tradition, I don't see this prior to it entering Tibet. I could be wrong, but I've seen no indication of this in the Indian tradition either, the Mahayana Indian tradition and the Indian tantras. I think it's a Tibetan innovation. So, similarly, if you were to train in Zen, you would find that the writings of Hakuan Zenji and Dogen for example, are infused with Confucian ideas. They're infused with Taoist teachings. They're infused with some Shinto sensibilities because if you were born in Japan at the times that they were living and you were raised there, as a young person, these were the general ideas that you heard people talking about, people that were important in your life: mom, dad, uncle, auntie, right? Grandpa, grandma. These were the concepts, the ideas, the ways of relating with each other in the world that were the standard. So you absorbed this. And even when these beings, these great beings, gained realization, they still talk about them in their teachings. Why? For the same reason that the Buddha basically only added emptiness and selflessness to Hinduism, right? He got rid of a few things from Hinduism, but the only thing that he genuinely added that wasn't there are the teachings on selflessness. Everything else could have been found in some streams of Hinduism in some form. Prior to him, he got rid of some of those things and he added selflessness. In the same way, just like collecting the stuff on the shore, these greatly realized beings went, well, everyone's talking about Confucianism, everyone's talking about Taoism. There are ways that these relate with the teachings that we're teaching, and they used them. They used them as tools to get the work done. As Westerners, in the same way, we need to use some scientific understanding that is the common basis that most of us share. We need to use some of the, and I say, please stay with me on this, but some of the theological frameworks that are just baked in to the way that we think about religion. Whether or not you like it, whether or not you've ever been religious, you carry around, because we are born in a culture that was Christian for over 1,000 years. Cultures, European descendant cultures. The very frameworks of language that break up the world into categories are, by and large, Christian or simply theological. The common ways that we break stuff up and think about them come from Christianity, and they come from Greek philosophy, and they come from European philosophy as it slowly started to break away from Christianity. If you've trained in any of these things, every single day you hear people talking in ways that someone invented in the 11th century, or talking in ways that somebody invented in the 16th century or 17th or 18th century somewhere in Europe. And they talk this way about Buddhism already. This is already happening. And they don't know, because they haven't studied these other things, that this is what they're doing. Let me give you one example. In the Buddhist system, in a lot of Asian systems, there is a dividing line drawn between direct experience and reason, right? There's a dividing line drawn, or not even a dividing line, in a lot of cases, sort of a continuum where someone begins with reason and then gets to the point where they have enough reasons to gain the direct experience. Then they do the thing, they do whatever's required, and they gain the direct experience, right? So this is the big dividing line. There's never been a major discussion of sort of dividing up the world into either being reason or faith, right? Which is the bedrock of how we think about stuff, usually as Western people. Well, is it just stuff you believe without any good reasons, or is it stuff that you have good reasons for, i.e., philosophy, science, secular humanism, psychology, etc., versus stuff you just believe because somebody wrote it down as a religious person who had a revelation. This is the other thing. We are used to religious systems that are revelatory, i.e., some great being goes out into the desert for 40 days. Some great being goes into a cave for 20 days or 40 days and encounters an angel. And that angel gives them a private message from the Creator. And the Creator says such and such. And the Creator's word is the truth. He brings it back, or in some cases, she brings it back, right? And now the world has to live by whatever the deity said. Eastern systems, by and large, are not designed quite like that. There are strains that are like that. But by and large, the system says, these systems in general, whether it's Hinduism, Taoism, Jainism, Buddhism, say there is a dividing line mainly between reason and experience. Most of us only have a bunch of reasons that we've put together about how we should do stuff in the world, and we live through these reasons that we've kind of constructed conceptually in our minds. And then there are those who have the direct experience of such and such. And because of that, they actually know what's going on in regards to some aspect of how things actually are in reality. And out of this experience, they then teach things. And yes, we could say that in some cases there are deities involved. Yes, we could say in some cases they spent 40 days in a cave, etc. However, with regards to all of the important things of the major Eastern religions, it's essentially perspiration, not inspiration. It is essentially experience and not revelation. You do the work, you look directly again and again and again, and then you see it. Period. And there are people who have seen, then there are people who haven't seen. And that's it. And there's a lot of work you need to do in order to see properly. So why Western Buddhism? Well, there's quite a bit of work that someone needs to do in order to make sure that when Buddhist things are being explained in Western culture, that these sorts of critical details about how we sort of almost naturally as Westerners, or in a lot of cases, global modern people, right? If you were raised with the descendant thought systems of Europe, which is practically everyone. And in some regards now, almost everyone has studied Christianity, and practically the entire world knows English, and almost everyone knows science, which by and large has been a European endeavor up until the last 100 years. So someone needs to do the work of making sure that all of these concepts are packed in to some of the frameworks that we already understand, and that in the cases where these things that are trying to be communicated through Buddhism cannot be communicated in the framework that you're currently living in, that the framework must be identified and changed. And it must be changed definitively through reason and then experience, not faith, right? Not because someone on high said that minds are non-physical, and therefore you have to believe minds are non-physical. So then Buddhism, right? Unfortunately, I think a lot of, especially people that are sort of in the vein that I'm in, if you will, a lot of people that are in the vein that they want to make Buddhism modern are getting rid of the Buddhism part of Buddhism. They're turning it into self-help. And that is absolutely tragic because the things they're eliminating, for the first time in history, we have non-philosophical reasons to accept. In particular, most sort of secular Western Buddhists or modern Buddhists, they say, oh, well, I'm a Buddhist, but no karma for me, thank you. I'm Buddhist, but, I really just think it's just this one lifetime and, my mind is my brain and that's it for me, thanks, right? For the first time in human history, we probably, I think, I have some very, very extensive research already prepared for this. I think we have better reasons than ever to think that the mind is non-physical, and none of those reasons are religious. I think we have better reason than ever to argue that karma is an extremely plausible model given a non-physical mind and what we know about quantum mechanics. These are now extremely plausible arguments without having to reference revelation from someone who knows, right? So we don't have to throw out any of Buddhism to do Buddhism in the West. This is my, probably I would say, my biggest pet peeve, is that almost everyone is throwing out, I would say, the baby with the bathwater. Because when you read the great Tibetan texts, when you read Tsongkhapa, when you read Jepa Bongka, when you read Yeshe Tsondru, when you read Yangtze Rinpoche, when you read Geshe Sopa, when you read Geshe Sonam Rinchen, I don't care who you're reading. If you read Nagarjuna, if you read Asanga, Aryadeva, if you read any of the great authors of Buddhism up until 1950 practically, the arguments are essentially the same from every single school in terms of what the essence of this activity is. And what's being thrown out in the West is the essence. What's being thrown out in the West is the essence. Ethics, which is karma, and rebirth, and the realms of rebirth. Meditation, according to the great texts on meditation, you can't do this unless you start with the ethics. So you're already done. Wisdom, sorry, no wisdom without the meditation, without the ethics that you're not going to do sufficiently because you don't accept karma and rebirth and non-physical minds and realms of rebirth. The very essence, the very beginning of these teachings is the fundamental material. Beginning with these topics that the Westerners don't like because they think that they're non-scientific and they think they can't be proved philosophically sufficiently, or that they can't be proved or extrapolated from what we know about physics and essentially what we can get at from direct experience, direct personal experience. And they can. We can keep everything. We don't have to throw away any part of Buddhism. We can keep the Buddhism in the Buddhism. Oh. So modern Western Buddhism is the name of this channel. The hope and the idea is that in the course of time, I will curate resources here. I'll invite people to speak from the Buddhist tradition. I will invite probably a few people from outside the Buddhist tradition to speak on some issues that are quite helpful as well. And the big activity, by and large, I think, will be simply talking about the biographies of great, great lay people throughout the history of Buddhism, and my own personal efforts based upon the teachings of my great mentor, Kimball Whitfield, to really make all of this material, make all of Buddhism without throwing out the Buddhism, accessible to non-retreating Western modern lay people. See you soon.